I knew what time the flood would arrive, 2:58 a.m. I had calculated it in October, when they forced me to tear the dam down. I lay in the dark on April 13th, listening to rain on the roof, watching the clock. My father built that dam in 1961. I'm a retired watershed engineer, 38 years. When I inherited the property, I inherited his maintenance logs, 11 notebooks, every inspection, every gauge reading, every storm event. The HOA tried to collect dues from me. My land isn't in their boundary, never was. When I disputed it, they filed a nuisance complaint to force my dam out. I sent them a warning letter. One sentence: removal will increase flood velocity at your subdivision by 340%. They signed the certified mail receipt and did nothing. At 2:17 a.m., the gauge hit 9.1 feet. My model said 9.1 feet. The flood arrived at 2:58. But, starting from the beginning, as always. Before we get into it, share your location in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Raymond Ogle had kept his father's engineering log since Harold Ogle died in 1987. A series of field notebooks, the earliest ones in Harold's handwriting, the later ones in Raymond's. The transition between the two hands visible in the 1987 volume, where Harold's entries stopped in March and Raymond's began in June. 3 months of silence between them, marking the time Raymond had needed to settle the estate and begin understanding what he had inherited. What he had inherited was a 22-acre parcel on Cutler Creek in the county's northern watershed. Mixed timber and open pasture, a farmhouse Harold had built in 1954, an equipment barn, a hayfield on the creek's eastern terrace, and a low-head earthen dam across the creek at the parcel's southern boundary that Harold had permitted and constructed in 1961 with the assistance of the county's Soil Conservation Service. The dam created a 2-acre impoundment, a pond that Harold had used for livestock watering and crop irrigation, that Raymond had maintained for the 35 years since his father's death, and that sat in the county's dam registry as permit number 1961-CR-004, a Class 1 agricultural impoundment in continuous permitted operation for 62 years. Raymond had been a civil engineer for 38 years before his retirement in 2018. Watershed hydrology and stormwater management, the specific discipline that made him the kind of person who understood what a low-head dam on a seasonal creek did not just to the pond behind it, but to the watershed below it. He had spent his career designing and evaluating exactly these structures, the small earthen impoundments that dotted the county's agricultural landscape, each one a node in the watershed's drainage network, each one shaping the timing and velocity of storm runoff in ways that were invisible in dry weather and consequential in wet. He had reviewed dam failure analyses, flood impact studies, downstream consequence assessments. He had written the technical sections of county floodplain management plans. He had testified before the State Water Resources Board on impoundment permit applications. He had brought all of that to the maintenance of his father's dam, because the dam was his father's, and because it was the right way to maintain a structure that sat above other people's property. The maintenance log for the Cutler Creek impoundment ran to 11 field notebooks, Harold's first entries from the dam's construction in 1961, the detailed construction notes of a careful farmer who had worked with the Soil Conservation Service engineer and had documented every lift of the earthen embankment, every compaction test, every culvert measurement. Raymond's entries began in 1987 and ran through 2022 in the methodical format of a professional engineer, maintaining a structure he understood completely. Annual inspection dates, embankment condition assessments, spillway clearance measurements, seepage observations at the toe, vegetation management on the embankment face, and the hydrological observations Raymond had added that Harold had not recorded, the creek gauge readings during storm events, the pond's storage volume calculations at various water surface elevations, the estimated downstream peak flow reduction during significant precipitation events. The 2019 structural assessment had been Raymond's most thorough documentation effort since his retirement. He had retained a licensed dam safety engineer named Carl Burrows, whose practice covered small dam inspection and certification throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, and had commissioned a full structural evaluation, embankment geometry survey, seepage analysis, spillway capacity assessment, and a downstream hazard classification review. Carl had produced a 28-page report finding the structure in good condition for its age, the embankment compaction adequate, the spillway capacity sufficient for the design storm, and the downstream hazard classification appropriate at Class 1, low hazard, meaning that dam failure would result in minimal property damage and no loss of life. The report had recommended 3 maintenance items, all of which Raymond had completed within 6 months of receiving it. He had filed Carl's report in the dam maintenance folder, the folder that now held the 1961 permit, the construction documentation, 62 years of maintenance logs, and the 2019 assessment, and had written in his engineering log, March 2019, structural assessment complete, Burroughs report on file, structure sound, recommended maintenance items, completed September 2019, next scheduled assessment, 2024. The Cutler Creek watershed above Raymond's parcel drained 4,200 acres of upland terrain, a mix of agricultural land, second-growth timber, and the county's northeastern residential development that had been expanding steadily since the 1990s. The watershed's natural drainage concentrated in Cutler Creek, which ran south from the upland basin through Raymond's parcel, and continued downstream through 2 miles of agricultural land before entering the floodplain zone, where Millbrook Crossing had been built in 2003. Raymond had noted Millbrook Crossing's construction in his engineering log in 2002, the year the County Planning Commission had approved the subdivision's site plan, which Raymond had reviewed as a public document because the site was in the Cutler Creek watershed, and he had professional reasons to understand what was being built downstream of his impoundment. He had written, October 2002, Millbrook Crossing subdivision approved, Cutler Creek floodplain, approximately 2.1 miles downstream of impoundment, 94 lots, primary road crossing at Creek's 100-year floodplain boundary. Site plan shows stormwater management ponds at subdivision's northern edge. Note, subdivision's eastern sector lots are within the creek's modeled 10-year floodplain. County floodplain map shows base flood elevation at 847.3 feet. Easternmost lots platted at 845 to 846 feet. Engineering concern. Eastern sector lots are below base flood elevation on county's own map. Monitor. He had noted the subdivision's completion in 2004. 94 homes built, occupied, the HOA established, the community road connecting to the county highway at the creek crossing. He had driven past it on his way to town and had looked at the eastern sector's lots, the houses closest to the creek, the yards sloping gently toward the water. The finished floor elevations that he estimated from the street were at or marginally above the county's mapped base flood elevation. He had written, 2004, Millbrook Crossing occupied. Eastern sector homes appear to be at or near BFE. Upstream impoundment provides approximately 8.4 acre-feet of flood storage at full pool. Estimated peak flow attenuation of 60 to 70% during 10-year storm event based on current watershed conditions. Subdivision's stormwater ponds appear undersized for watershed's upper basin contribution. Note for file. He had noted it for the file and had gone on with his life. The dam was functioning. The creek was behaving. The downstream neighborhood was new and occupied, and its residents had no reason to know that the pond 2 miles upstream was doing anything for them at all. The HOA assessment notice had arrived in January 2019, a standard HOA fee statement from Millbrook Crossing Community Association, addressed to Raymond Ogle at his Cutler Creek parcel address, assessing annual HOA dues of $840 for the 2019 calendar year. Raymond had looked at it for a moment, the letterhead, the amount, his parcel address, and had set it on his desk and had pulled the county's parcel map from his files. His parcel 44-0112-001, was an agricultural parcel in the county's northern watershed zone. It was not within the Millbrook Crossing subdivision boundary. It was not within the HOA's recorded covenant area. It was 2.1 miles upstream of the subdivision's northern boundary. His parcel and the HOA's covenant area shared a watershed. The creek connected them. But sharing a watershed was not the same as sharing an association boundary, and the HOA had no legal basis to assess his property for dues. He had called the HOA's management company the following week and had spoken to a coordinator named Beth Rollins, who had been apologetic and had said, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ogle. There must have been a data entry error when the assessment roll was updated. I'll look into it and have it corrected." He had said, "I'd appreciate confirmation in writing when it's corrected." The written confirmation had not arrived. The 2020 assessment notice had arrived in January 2020. Same amount, same error. He had called again. Beth had been apologetic again. He had sent a written dispute letter with a copy of the county parcel map, showing his parcel's location relative to the HOA boundary. He had received an acknowledgement. The 2021 assessment notice had arrived in January 2021. He had sent another written dispute letter, this time by certified mail, with the parcel map, the county assessor's parcel data sheet showing his parcel's agricultural zoning, and its address outside the HOA's recorded covenant area, and a brief statement. This parcel is not within the Millbrook Crossing HOA's recorded covenant boundary. I am not a member of the association and am not subject to its assessments. Please remove this parcel from your assessment roll and confirm the correction in writing. The certified mail green card had come back, signed. The written confirmation had not arrived. The 2022 assessment notice had arrived in January 2022, with a late fee added for the 2021 unpaid balance. Raymond had written in his engineering log, January 2022, fourth consecutive erroneous HOA assessment received. 3 written disputes filed, 2 certified mail, no correction. 2022 notice includes late fee on 2021 balance I do not owe. Total claimed, $1,847. My parcel is not within the HOA boundary. File, current. Next step, legal. He had called Linda Voss in February 2022. Linda had reviewed the 4 years of correspondence, the parcel map, the HOA's recorded covenant documents, and the county assessor's parcel data in one meeting. She had said, "Your parcel is unambiguously outside the HOA's covenant boundary. The assessment has no legal basis. I'll send the management company a formal legal notice of dispute and demand for correction. If they don't correct it within 30 days, I'll file a declaratory judgment action." She had sent the notice. The management company had forwarded it to the HOA's board. The board had forwarded it to Gary Sutter. Gary had called Linda in March and had said, "The board's position is that Raymond Ogle's parcel benefits from the HOA's road maintenance and community amenities by virtue of its location in the adjacent watershed and should contribute to those costs." Linda had said, "That is not how HOA assessments work. HOA assessments apply to parcels within the recorded covenant boundary. Raymond Ogle's parcel is not within the recorded covenant boundary. It is an agricultural parcel 2.1 miles upstream of your subdivision. Benefit from proximity is not the legal standard. Recorded covenant membership is the legal standard. Your assessment has no basis." Gary had said he would advise the board. The board had met in April 2022 and had voted 4-1 to pursue collection through the county's agricultural nuisance abatement process, characterizing Raymond's Dam as an unpermitted agricultural structure, creating downstream nuisance conditions. The abatement complaint serving as leverage to compel payment of the disputed assessments. Connie Marsh had presented the strategy to the board as a collections tool, a way to apply regulatory pressure to a property owner who had been disputing a legitimate assessment for 4 years. The board had voted. Gary had filed the complaint with the county's agricultural nuisance office in May 2022. Raymond had received the county removal notice in June 2022, a 2-page document on county letterhead, citing the HOA's abatement complaint, characterizing the dam as an unpermitted structure, creating downstream drainage concerns, and ordering removal within 180 days. He had read it at his desk. He had read it twice. He had pulled the 1961 permit from the dam maintenance folder, the original county permit, signed by the Soil Conservation Service district engineer. The permit number 1961-CR-004. The structure described in the permit's technical specifications, with the embankment dimensions, the spillway design, the downstream hazard classification. He had set it beside the removal notice and had read both documents. The removal notice said the structure was unpermitted. The 1961 permit said otherwise. The removal notice had been issued on the basis of the HOA's complaint. The HOA's complaint had been filed as collections leverage for an assessment that had no legal basis. He had looked at the removal notice for a long moment. He had been an engineer for 38 years. He knew exactly what removing the dam would do to the creek below it. He had been calculating it, in one form or another, since he had watched Millbrook Crossing go up in the creek's floodplain in 2003, and had written engineering concern in his log, and filed the note away. He had opened his engineering log and written, June 14, 2022, County Removal Notice Received. Basis, HOA Abatement Complaint. Structure characterized as unpermitted. Incorrect. Permit 1961-CR-004 on file. Notice issued without independent engineering review. Downstream impact of removal. Significant. File documents complete. Call Linda Voss. He had called her that afternoon. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, Linda, Raymond Ogle, the county has issued a removal notice for my dam. It was filed by the Millbrook Crossing HOA as part of their collection attempt for the assessment I don't owe. She had said, I've seen worse tactics. What's the dam status? He had said, permitted 1961, maintained continuously, structurally assessed in 2019 by a licensed dam safety engineer. Clean bill of health. The removal notice characterizes it as unpermitted. It was issued without any independent engineering review of the complaint's technical claims. She had said, so we fight it. He had said, we fight it. And Linda, I need you to understand something before we file anything. This dam attenuates peak storm flows on Cutler Creek. The Millbrook Crossing subdivision is built in the creek's natural floodplain, 2.1 miles downstream. If this dam is removed, the next significant storm event will hit that neighborhood at full watershed velocity, without any upstream storage to buffer it. I have been calculating that since 2002 when they built down there. She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, how significant is the impact? He had said, I'll have the numbers for you in 2 weeks. But the short answer is that the HOA has filed a complaint to remove a structure that is the primary flood buffer for their own neighborhood. They don't know that. Nobody told them because nobody asked me, and nobody commissioned an engineering review. Linda had said, write the numbers down, every calculation, every assumption, every data source. I want a document that a judge can read and understand, and that an opposing engineer cannot find a flaw in. He had said, I'll write 40 pages if I need to. She had said, write what it takes. He had set the phone down and had opened his engineering log to a fresh page. He had written at the top, June 14, 2022, Downstream Impact Analysis, Cutler Creek Impoundment Removal. Begin. Raymond had worked on the analysis for 3 weeks. The kitchen table cleared of everything except the engineering log, the USGS gauge records he had pulled from the Federal Water Data Portal, the watershed delineation maps he had drawn himself from the county's topographic survey data, and the 11 field notebooks of maintenance logs that formed the observational foundation of everything he was about to calculate. He had structured the document the way he had structured every technical report in his professional career. Existing conditions first, then the change being evaluated, then the downstream consequence of the change, then the confidence interval on each calculation, then the sources. A reader who understood hydrology would find every assumption stated and every data source cited. A reader who did not understand hydrology would find the plain language summary at the front of each section that told them what the numbers meant before they encountered the numbers. The document was 42 pages when he finished. He had counted them twice. The existing conditions section had been the foundation, 14 pages establishing what the Cutler Creek watershed looked like hydrologically before any change was considered. Because you could not calculate the effect of removing a dam without first establishing precisely what the dam was doing. Raymond had begun with the watershed delineation, the 4,200-acre drainage basin above his impoundment. The basin boundary traced from the county's topographic data along the ridge lines that defined which precipitation events drained to Cutler Creek and which drained elsewhere. He had calculated the basin's characteristics, the area, the average slope, the land cover mix, the ratio of agricultural to forested to developed land, the developed fraction having increased from 8% in 1961 to 23% by 2022, as the county's northeastern residential growth had extended into the upper watershed. The increased developed fraction mattered because impervious surfaces, rooftops, roads, parking lots, generated runoff faster and in greater volume than the agricultural and forested land they replaced, increasing the watershed's peak flow response to storm events. He had then established the impoundment's storage characteristics: the pond's surface area at normal pool, the storage volume calculation at 3 water surface elevations corresponding to normal pool, the emergency spillway crest, and the dam's top. The relationship between water surface elevation and storage volume, defining the impoundment's capacity to absorb incoming runoff during a storm event before discharging through the spillway. He had surveyed the pond's bathymetry himself in July 2022, using a survey rod and a tape measure from a canoe, the kind of field work a retired engineer does on a Saturday morning because he wants the numbers to be his numbers, not interpolated from a 1961 construction drawing. The existing conditions section's final calculation was the flood attenuation analysis, the quantification of what the impoundment did to peak storm flows at the downstream boundary of Raymond's parcel during design storm events. Raymond had used the TR55 methodology, the standard small watershed hydrological method used by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The same methodology the Soil Conservation Service engineer had used in 1961 when the dam was designed. He had run the calculations for 3 storm events: the 2-year storm, the 10-year storm, and the 25-year storm, the standard return periods used in floodplain management and downstream impact analysis. The results for the 10-year storm event were the numbers that mattered most for the downstream analysis, because the 10-year storm was the design standard used for the Millbrook Crossing subdivision's stormwater management system. The storm size the subdivision's drainage infrastructure had been sized to handle. The existing conditions calculation showed that with the impoundment in place, the 10-year storm produced a peak discharge at Raymond's downstream parcel boundary of 284 cubic feet per second. Without the impoundment, the scenario Raymond had modeled as the removal condition, the same storm produced a peak discharge of 1,247 cubic feet per second at the same point. He had written the comparison in the section's plain language summary and had underlined it. With the impoundment in place, the 10-year storm produces a peak discharge of 284 cubic feet per second at the downstream parcel boundary. Without the impoundment, the same storm produces 1,247 cubic feet per second at the same location. The impoundment reduces peak discharge by 963 cubic feet per second, a reduction of 77%. Conversely, removal of the impoundment would increase peak discharge at this location by approximately 340% above the attenuated value. The 340% figure. He had calculated it from first principles, checked it against the TR55 results, rechecked it against a simplified, rational method calculation as an independent verification, and confirmed it 3 times before writing it in the document. It was the right number. He wished it were smaller. The downstream impacts section had required Raymond to extend his analysis beyond his parcel boundary, to trace the increased peak flow from his downstream parcel line to the Millbrook Crossing floodplain, accounting for the channel's routing characteristics, the tributary inflows between his property and the subdivision, and the floodplain's hydraulic response to the increased flow. He had used the HEC-RAS hydraulic modeling software, the standard tool for this type of channel routing analysis, running the model on his laptop with cross-section data he had extracted from the county's LiDAR terrain dataset. The routing analysis had shown that the watershed between Raymond's parcel and Millbrook Crossing contributed additional runoff during a storm event. The 2-mile reach had its own drainage area, approximately 340 acres of mostly agricultural land, that added to the peak flow as it traveled downstream. Raymond had calculated the combined peak flow arriving at Millbrook Crossing's northern boundary under both scenarios, the existing conditions scenario with the impoundment in place, and the removal scenario without it. With the impoundment, 412 cubic feet per second arriving at Millbrook Crossing's northern boundary during the 10-year storm. Without the impoundment, 1,581 cubic feet per second arriving at the same point. He had looked at the 1,581 figure for a long time before he wrote it in the document. He had rechecked the routing model inputs. He had rechecked the tributary area calculation. He had rerun the HEC-RAS model with slightly different Manning's roughness coefficients to test the sensitivity of the result. The number moved between 1,490 and 1,620, depending on the roughness assumption. The central estimate was 1,581. He had written the range in the document and used 1,581 as the central estimate. He had then looked up the Millbrook Crossing Subdivision's Stormwater Management Plan from the County Planning Commission's 2002 approval file, a public document available at the county's records office. The plan showed the subdivision's stormwater management ponds sized for a 10-year design storm with a peak inflow of 380 cubic feet per second from the on-site drainage area plus the creek's contribution. The creek's contribution having been estimated in the 2002 analysis at 390 cubic feet per second under existing watershed conditions. The total design flow for the subdivision's drainage infrastructure, 770 cubic feet per second. The removal scenario's 1,581 cubic feet per second was more than twice the infrastructure's design capacity. He had written in the downstream impact section's plain language summary. The Millbrook Crossing Subdivision's stormwater infrastructure was designed for a combined peak inflow of approximately 770 cubic feet per second during the 10-year storm event. Under existing conditions, with the impoundment in place, the estimated peak flow from Cutler Creek at the subdivision boundary is 412 cubic feet per second, within the infrastructure's design envelope. Under removal conditions without the impoundment, the estimated peak flow from Cutler Creek at the subdivision boundary is 1,581 cubic feet per second, more than twice the infrastructure's design capacity. The subdivision's eastern sector lots, which are at or near the base flood elevation per the county's current firm panel, would be subject to inundation during a 10-year storm event under removal conditions. Firm panel, flood insurance rate map. He had pulled the current panel from the FEMA Map Service Center and had noted the base flood elevation at the Millbrook Crossing eastern sector, 847.3 feet. He had extracted the ground elevations of the eastern sector lots from the county's LiDAR data. 11 of the lots had ground elevations between 845.8 and 847.1 feet, below or marginally above the base flood elevation. Under the removal scenario's modeled flood stage, the water surface elevation at those lots during the 10-year storm would reach 849.2 feet. The ground floor elevations of the homes on those lots, estimated from the LiDAR data and the county's building permit records, were between 847.0 and 848.4 feet. He had written, under removal conditions, an estimated 11 to 18 homes in the eastern sector of Millbrook Crossing are at risk of first-floor inundation during a 10-year storm event. He had set the pen down and had looked at that sentence, 11 to 18 homes. He had written it in a technical document as a range with a confidence interval and a modeling uncertainty statement. 11 to 18 homes meant 11 to 18 families. It meant flooring and drywall and furniture and the accumulated physical contents of people's lives sitting in water that would arrive faster and deeper than their subdivision's drainage system had been designed to handle, because a 2-acre pond 2 miles upstream had been removed on the basis of a complaint filed as collections leverage for an HOA fee that had no legal basis. He had finished the document 3 days later, the conclusions section, the confidence interval discussion, the data sources appendix, and the exhibits, the 1961 permit, the 2019 structural assessment, the field notebook extracts showing 62 years of maintenance records, the watershed delineation map, the HEC-RAS model output tables, and the FIRM panel extract showing the eastern sector's flood elevation, 42 pages. The cover letter had been 1 page. Linda's letter to the county's agricultural nuisance office, formal and precise, presenting the objection and requesting a hearing. The letter's second paragraph listed the 42-page technical analysis as an attachment and summarized its primary findings in 3 sentences. The third paragraph addressed the permit question. the 1961 permit number, the continuous permitted operation, the removal notice's characterization of the structure as unpermitted being factually incorrect on the face of the county's own permit records. The fourth paragraph was Raymond's. Linda had drafted the letter and had sent it to him for review, and he had read it and had called her and had said, "I want to add one sentence to the HOA's copy of the cover letter. Not to the county's copy, to the HOA's copy." She had said, "What sentence?" He had said, "I want them to know what the analysis shows." One sentence, direct. She had said, "Read it to me." He had said, "Removal of this structure will increase peak storm flow velocity at the Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary by an estimated 340% during a 10-year storm event." Linda had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "You want to put that in writing to the HOA?" He had said, "I want it in writing so it's in the record. I want them to have been told. I want the date on the letter and the certified mail receipt and the board president's signature on the green card. I want it documented that they knew, or were given everything they needed to know, before anything happened downstream." She had said, "I'll add it." The county had received the objection package on August 8, 2022, the 42-page analysis, the 1961 permit, the 62 years of maintenance records, the 2019 structural assessment, and Linda's cover letter. The Agricultural Nuisance Office had assigned it to a staff reviewer named Dennis Carr, a county employee whose background was in agricultural land use compliance and who had no engineering training and no hydrology background. Dennis had read the cover letter and had looked at the 42-page technical document and had written in his review notes, "Extensive technical submission. Recommend referral to County Engineer's Office for review." The referral had sat in the County Engineer's Office inbox for 3 weeks. The County Engineer's Office had not responded. Connie Marsh had called the County Commissioner's Office twice during that period. Dennis's supervisor had confirmed this in a later administrative review, expressing the HOA's position that the dam removal was urgent and that the objection was a delay tactic by a property owner resisting legitimate abatement. The Commissioner's Office had called Dennis's supervisor. The supervisor had called Dennis. Dennis had written a 1-page determination upholding the removal notice, citing the HOA's complaint, acknowledging Raymond's objection, and stating that the objection's technical claims had been reviewed and did not alter the determination. The technical claims had not been reviewed. The county engineer's office had never responded to the referral. No independent engineer had been engaged. Dennis had written "reviewed" in the determination because he had read the cover letter and looked at the pages, and that was, in his understanding, what review meant. The determination had been mailed to Linda on September 14, 2022. She had called Raymond the same afternoon. She had said, "The county upheld the removal notice. The determination says the technical objection was reviewed. It wasn't. No engineer looked at the analysis. The county engineer's office never responded to the referral request." Dennis Carr wrote a 1-page determination based on the cover letter. Raymond had said, "They didn't read it." She had said, "They did not read it." He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "They will." She had said, "Raymond, I want to appeal the determination to the county commission. We have a strong record, the permit, the analysis, the referral that was never completed. The commission can order an independent engineering review." He had said, "How long does the appeal take?" She had said, 60 to 90 days for a hearing date. He had said, "And the removal deadline." She had said, 180 days from the original notice. The notice was issued June 14th. The deadline is December 11th. He had said, "File the appeal." But Linda, if the appeal fails and the deadline holds, the dam comes out before December 11th. She had said, "The appeal may succeed." He had said, "It may. File it and let's see. But I want you to understand something. If this dam comes out, the record I've built is complete. The permit, the analysis, the warning letter to the HOA, the county's determination that was written without an engineering review. Every document is dated. Every calculation is sourced. Every assumption is stated. If the creek floods downstream after this dam is removed, that file is the most complete record of proximate cause I have ever assembled in 38 years of engineering work." Linda had said, "I know." He had said, "Make sure the HOA's copy of the warning letter is in the certified mail log with the delivery date. I want the green card scanned and in the file." She had said, "It already is." He had set the phone down and had looked out the window at the pond. The 2-acre impoundment his father had built in 1961. The surface still in the September afternoon. The spillway running at its normal late summer trickle. The earthen embankment solid and grassed on its downstream face, exactly as Carl Burroughs had found it in 2019. The appeal would take 60 to 90 days. The deadline was December 11th. The creek ran south from his property for 2 miles before it reached the floodplain, where 94 families lived in houses that had been built at or near the base flood elevation, in a watershed whose primary upstream flood buffer was the structure a county staff employee with no engineering background had just upheld a removal order for without reading the analysis. He opened the engineering log and wrote, September 14th, 2022, county determination received. Removal notice upheld. Technical objection not reviewed by engineer. Appeal filed. Removal deadline, December 11th, 2022. Warning letter to HOA, delivered, certified mail, signed receipt on file. The record is complete. He looked at the pond one more time. The record is complete. The County Commission appeal hearing had been scheduled for October 11th, 60 days after Linda filed. The hearing docketed before a 3-member panel with the county engineer's office, directed to appear and explain the referral that had never been completed. Raymond had prepared a presentation. The 42-page analysis condensed to a 12-slide summary. The key calculations on 3 slides. The warning letter to the HOA and its certified mail receipt on 1 slide. The county engineer's referral request and the absence of any response on the final slide. The hearing had been canceled on October 8th. The commissioner, whose district included the Millbrook Crossing subdivision, had called the commission chair on October 7th and had said that the matter was straightforward, that the county's determination had been issued through the proper process, and that scheduling a full commission hearing on an agricultural nuisance abatement order was an inefficient use of commission time when the determination had already been reviewed and upheld. The commission chair had agreed. The hearing had been canceled and replaced with a written decision affirming the staff determination. The written decision issued without a hearing, without an engineering review, and without any of the procedural protections a formal commission hearing would have provided. Linda had called Raymond on October 9th. She had said, "The appeal was dismissed without a hearing. Written decision affirming the staff determination." The commissioner from the Millbrook Crossing district called the chair and got the hearing pulled. Raymond had said, "What are our options?" She had said, "We can file in circuit court for judicial review of the administrative determination. That process takes 4 to 6 months minimum, and the removal deadline is December 11th. We cannot get a circuit court ruling before December 11th. He had said, "So the dam comes out." She had said, "Unless we get a temporary restraining order to stay the removal deadline while the circuit court proceeding runs. I can file for a TRO, but I need to show irreparable harm and likelihood of success on the merits. The irreparable harm showing is strong. Your downstream impact analysis is exactly the kind of evidence that supports irreparable harm. The likelihood of success depends on the court's assessment of the administrative record and whether the failure to conduct an engineering review was a procedural error sufficient to vacate the determination." Raymond had said, "File for the TRO." She had filed on October 12th. The circuit court had denied the TRO on October 19th, a 1-page order finding that the administrative determination had been issued through the county's established process, and that the petitioner had not demonstrated a sufficient probability of success on the merits to justify staying a regulatory determination that had been upheld through the county's administrative appeal process. The judge had not reviewed the 42-page analysis. He had reviewed the administrative record, which showed a determination issued, an objection received, and a determination upheld. The process had been followed. That was what the administrative record showed. Linda had called Raymond on October 20th. She had said, "TRO denied. The removal deadline is December 11th. He had said, "I'll begin planning the removal." She had said, "Raymond, I want to continue the circuit court case, even with the TRO denied. The underlying merits, the failure to conduct an engineering review, the commissioner's intervention in the appeal process, those are legitimate grounds for vacating the determination. If we get a ruling after the removal that the determination was improper, it strengthens the damages case significantly." He had said, "Continue it." And Linda, I'm going to document the removal the same way I documented the dam's construction and maintenance, day by day. Everything photographed, everything in the log. She had said, treat every day of the removal as a deposition exhibit. He had said, that's exactly how I'll treat it. Raymond had hired a licensed contractor for the removal, a site work firm named Hargrove Excavating, whose principal, Tom Hargrove, had done earthwork in the county for 22 years and had completed 2 previous dam removals under VDEQ permits. Raymond had specified the removal method to Tom in a written scope document. The removal would be conducted in accordance with the State Water Control Board's dam removal guidelines. The embankment would be notched and lowered incrementally to allow the pond to drain gradually, rather than releasing stored water in a surge. The culvert pipe would be removed and the channel cross-section restored to approximate pre-dam dimensions, and all disturbed areas would be seeded with an erosion control mix within 48 hours of final grading. He had specified the documentation requirements separately, a requirement Tom had not encountered from a property owner before, and had accepted without objection because Raymond had explained it plainly. This removal is being conducted under legal compulsion that I believe is improper, and the documentation will be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Tom had said, understood. My crew will work with your camera. Raymond had applied for the required state removal permit on October 15th, the permit application to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, the state agency that regulated dam removals in the watershed, a separate requirement from the county's abatement order. The VDEQ had issued the permit on October 24th with standard conditions: the incremental drawdown method, the erosion control seeding, the channel restoration, and a downstream notification requirement, a condition that required Raymond to notify downstream property owners within 1 mile of the planned removal dates. He had read the downstream notification requirement and had written in his engineering log, October 24th, 2022, VDEQ removal permit issued. Downstream notification required. Property owners within 1 mile. Millbrook Crossing HOA is within 1 mile. Notification will be sent certified mail. Cover letter will reference the 42-page analysis and the August 2022 warning letter. This will be the second written notice to the HOA of downstream impact. He had drafted the downstream notification letter that evening. The VDEQ required notice of removal dates, the planned incremental drawdown schedule, and a paragraph he had added beyond the regulatory minimum. As noted in my August 2022 correspondence to the Millbrook Crossing HOA Board, removal of this structure will increase peak storm flow velocity at your subdivision's floodplain boundary during significant storm events. My hydrological analysis of the downstream impact, submitted to the county in August 2022, remains on file with the county's Agricultural Nuisance Office and with my attorney, Linda Voss. I recommend the board obtain an independent engineering review of the downstream impact before the removal is completed. He had sent the notification by certified mail on October 25th. Connie Marsh had signed the green card on October 27th. The removal had begun on October 25th. Tom Hargrove's crew arriving at 7 a.m. with an excavator, a track loader, and 2 dump trucks, the equipment staged on the dry ground east of the pond's embankment, where Raymond had cleared a work area the previous weekend. Raymond had been at the site at 6:30, his camera ready, his engineering log open on the tailgate of his truck. He had photographed the dam before the first machine moved, the full embankment from 3 angles, the upstream face with the pond at normal pool behind it, the downstream face with the grassed slope and the tow drain outlet, the spillway structure from both the pond side and the downstream side, and the creek channel below the dam, showing the natural channel form that existed downstream of the structure. The before condition record. Day 1. Tom's crew had notched the embankment's left abutment, cutting a controlled notch through the embankment at its lowest point, the notch sized to allow a controlled release of the pond's stored water at a rate that would not produce a surge downstream. The pond had begun dropping at approximately 4 inches per hour, the outflow through the notch running clear over the gravel bar below the dam. Raymond had measured and recorded the pond's water surface elevation every 2 hours and had photographed the notch outflow at each measurement. He had written the day's log entry that evening, October 25th, 2022, Day 1, notch cut at left abutment, pond dropping at 4 inches per hour. Outflow, clear, no turbidity. Downstream channel, normal. Weather, clear. Documentation, 34 photographs. Day 2. The pond had dropped 18 inches overnight, the notch flow slowing as the head decreased. Tom's crew had widened the notch and had begun removing the embankment's upper section with the excavator. The material loaded into dump trucks and hauled to a staging area Raymond had designated at the field's northern edge. The material would be used for the channel bank restoration after the structure was fully removed. Raymond had photographed every excavator pass, the embankment section diminishing with each load, the pond behind it dropping steadily. October 26, 2022, Day 2. Embankment upper section removed to elevation 849.0. Pond at 847.8. Outflow increasing as notch widened. Downstream turbidity, low, within normal construction range. Documentation, 41 photographs. Day 3. The pond had been at 846.1 by morning, 5.7 feet below its original normal pool elevation. The 2-acre surface contracted to perhaps a third of its original area, the pond's margins showing the mudflats of exposed bottom sediment that had accumulated over 62 years of impoundment. The culvert removal had begun, Tom's crew excavating along the pipe's alignment, exposing the corrugated metal sections that Harold had installed in 1961, pulling them out in 4-foot segments. Raymond had noted each segment in his log with its condition, the upstream sections heavily corroded, the downstream sections in better condition, the material consistent with a 61-year-old metal structure that had been functional throughout its service life. October 27, 2022, Day 3. Culvert removal complete. Pond at 846.1. Channel bottom exposed at dam footprint. Former pond area, 60% drained. Weather, overcast, no precipitation. Documentation, 38 photographs. Day 4. The final day of active removal. The embankment's remaining material had come out in the morning, the last of the earthen structure, 62 years of compacted fill that Harold had placed lift by lift, with the Soil Conservation Service engineer watching the compaction tests, now loaded into dump trucks and graded into the channel bank restoration. Tom's crew had shaped the restored channel cross-section through the former dam footprint, the dimensions taken from Raymond's survey of the natural channel downstream, the intent to restore the channel to something approximating its pre-1961 form. The erosion control seeding had been applied by afternoon, the hydraulic seeder truck moving along the disturbed banks, the seed mix specified in the VDEQ permit, coating the raw soil in a green slurry that would establish cover within 2 weeks if the weather cooperated. Raymond had stood at the former dam site at 4 p.m. on October 28th and had looked at what remained. The creek ran through the gap where the embankment had stood, the water moving at its October low flow rate, the channel restored to its approximate natural cross-section, the gravel bars that the impoundment had buried under 62 years of sediment beginning to emerge as the last of the stored water drained away. The pond was gone. The 2-acre surface, the livestock watering point, the irrigation source Harold had built and Raymond had maintained for the combined span of their lives, gone, replaced by a creek running through a restored channel in an October afternoon that looked entirely ordinary from a distance and entirely wrong to Raymond Ogle standing at its edge. He had photographed the completed removal from the same 3 angles he had used for the before condition record: the upstream view, the downstream view, the channel cross-section at the former dam footprint. He had noted the time in the log, 4:17 p.m. He had written the day's entry, October 28, 2022, Day 4, removal complete. Embankment, removed. Culvert, removed. Channel, restored to approximate pre-dam cross-section. Erosion control seeding, applied. VDEQ permit conditions, satisfied. Structure removed as ordered under County Agricultural Nuisance Abatement Notice. 62-year service life, 1961 to 2022. He had paused. He had looked downstream, the creek running south through his property toward the 2 miles of agricultural land that separated his southern boundary from the Millbrook Crossing floodplain. The water was low and clear in the October channel. The fall flow rate, the watershed dry after a rainless September. Nothing in the creek's appearance on October 28th suggested what it would look like when the watershed's first significant storm event pushed full drainage through a channel that no longer had 8.4 acre-feet of upstream storage to slow it down. He had written the final line of the October 28th entry. Downstream impact, pending first significant storm event. He had driven back to the house and had typed the final letter to the HOA's board at his desk. A one-page letter on plain paper, addressed to Connie Marsh and to each of the 4 board members by name, sent by certified mail the following morning. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph: this letter is to inform you that the Cutler Creek agricultural impoundment on my property at parcel 44-0112-001 has been removed as ordered under the county's agricultural nuisance abatement notice. Removal was completed October 28, 2022, in accordance with VDEQ removal permit conditions. The second paragraph: my hydrological analysis of the downstream impact of this removal, submitted to the County Agricultural Nuisance Office in August 2022, and provided to your board with the downstream notification letter dated October 25, 2022, remains on file with the county and with my attorney, Linda Voss, at the address below. I recommend the board obtain and review this analysis. The third paragraph was one sentence. The analysis is on file. I recommend the board review it before the watershed's next significant storm event. Connie had received the letter on November 1st. She had read the first paragraph and had set it in her inbox. She had read the second paragraph and had thought, he sent us that analysis in August, and we forwarded it to Gary, and Gary said it was an objection tactic. She had read the third paragraph and had thought, the dam is removed, the matter is resolved. This is the last correspondence from Raymond Ogle on this subject. She had written a note to the management company's collections coordinator. Ogle matter resolved. Dam removal completed per abatement order. Remove from collections file. Close. She had set the letter in the filing cabinet under abatement, resolved, and had gone to the next item on her desk. The collections coordinator had closed the file. The certified mail green card had come back signed on November 3rd. Linda Voss had scanned it and added it to the case file. The second green card, the second documented delivery, the second signed receipt confirming that Connie Marsh had received written notice of the downstream impact analysis and its recommendation. Raymond had looked at the scan when Linda emailed it to him and had added one line to his engineering log. November 3rd, 2022. Second warning letter. Delivered. Signed receipt confirmed. HOA correspondence. 2 warnings. 2 certified mail receipts. 2 green cards. File. Complete. He had closed the log and had looked out the window at the field where the pond had been, the empty basin visible from the house, the creek running through it at its October level, the grassed embankment footprint already beginning to blend into the surrounding landscape. By spring, the seeding would have established, and the former dam site would be unremarkable to anyone who had not known what had been there. Raymond knew what had been there. He knew what was not there now. He knew what the creek would do when the rain came. He had written one more line at the bottom of the November 3rd entry, below the file notation, in the specific handwriting of a man recording a fact rather than an opinion. The watershed will test this in its own time. The storm had been in the forecast since April 11th. A low-pressure system moving northeast from the Gulf, the National Weather Service issuing a flash flood watch for the county on the afternoon of April 12th, with a predicted rainfall accumulation of 3 to 5 inches over a 24-hour period. Raymond had read the watch notice on his laptop at 3 p.m. on the 12th and had opened his engineering log to a fresh page. He had written, April 12th, 2023, NWS flash flood watch issued. Predicted accumulation, 3 to 5 inches, 24-hour period. Cutler Creek watershed, 4,200 acres. Antecedent soil moisture, wet. March precipitation above normal, ground near field capacity. Storm arrival, forecast 8 to 10 p.m., April 13th. This is the test. He had underlined the last sentence, not for drama, for precision. He had been waiting for a storm event of this magnitude since October 28, 2022, the way an engineer waits for a loading condition he has already calculated the consequences of. The calculation was in the file. The question April 13th would answer was whether the field matched the model. He had spent April 12th in preparation. checking the creek gauge he had maintained on his property since 2004, a staff gauge installed in the creek's main channel at the southern boundary of his parcel, the point he had used as the reference location for all his downstream impact calculations. The gauge was a painted steel staff, graduated in tenths of a foot, set in a concrete footing at the creek's bank at a known elevation above the channel bottom. He had read it at every significant storm event for 19 years and had recorded the readings in his engineering log alongside the NWS rainfall data for the watershed. The gauge record was one of the data sources he had cited in the 42-page analysis. He had cleared debris from the gauge's staff, confirmed the footing was undamaged from the winter, and noted the pre-storm reading in his log. April 12th, 4:45 p.m. Pre-storm gauge, 0.8 feet. Low flow, clear. Channel, normal. He had driven to the former dam site and had looked at the restored channel, the creek running at its spring low flow rate through the gap where the embankment had stood. The erosion control seating from October, now a solid grass stand on the restored banks, the site looking unremarkable and permanent. The creek ran through it without hesitation, the water clear, the channel exactly as Tom Hargrove's crew had left it 6 months earlier. Raymond had looked at the channel for a moment and had driven back to the house. The rain had started at 9:17 p.m. on April 13th. Raymond noting the time in his log when he heard it on the roof, a steady, moderate rain that intensified within 30 minutes to a heavy downpour, the sound on the metal roof of the equipment barn audible from the house. He had checked the NWS radar on his laptop at 9:45. The storm cell was centered on the upper watershed, the heaviest precipitation band tracking directly across the 4,200-acre drainage basin above his property. The radar's estimated precipitation rate in the heaviest band was showing 2 inches per hour. He had set his alarm for midnight and had lain down without undressing. He had not expected to sleep, and he had not slept. He had lain in the dark and had listened to the rain and had thought about the numbers, the TR-55 calculations, the HEC-RAS routing model, the 1,581 cubic feet per second peak flow estimate at the Millbrook crossing boundary, the subdivision's 770 cubic feet per second design capacity, the eastern sector lots with their ground elevations between 845.8 and 847.1 feet, and the modeled flood stage of 849.2. He had gotten up at 11:30 and had driven to the gauge. The creek was up. The pre-storm reading had been 0.8 feet. At 11:45 p.m., the gauge read 3.2 feet, a rise of 2.4 feet in 2.5 hours of rain. The water was turbid, the color of coffee with cream, the surface running fast with the organic debris that a rising creek pulls from its banks in the early stage of a storm event. Leaf litter, small branches, the accumulated material of a watershed releasing its stored water. The flow was already beyond normal bankful conditions, the water beginning to spread onto the low terrace on the channel's eastern side. Raymond had read the gauge with his flashlight, written the reading in his log, and driven back to the house. April 13th, 11:45 p.m. Gauge, 3.2 feet, rising. Rainfall continuing, heavy. Upper watershed receiving estimated 1.8 to 2.1 inches per hour, based on NWS radar. Peak flow not yet arrived. He had checked the radar at midnight. The storm cell still centered on the upper watershed, the heaviest band now moving slightly southeast, the rainfall rate sustained. The NWS had upgraded the flash flood watch to a flash flood warning at 11:58 p.m., the warning stating that Cutler Creek and its tributaries were expected to reach flood stage by 2 a.m. He had driven back to the gauge at 12:30 a.m. The gauge read 5.7 feet. He had stood at the gauge and looked at the creek, the water spreading well beyond its banks now, the low terrace fully inundated, the turbid flow carrying larger debris, a section of wooden fence rail from somewhere upstream, rotating slowly in the current as it passed. The sound of the creek had changed from the normal murmur of moving water to the specific low roar of a creek running at flood stage, the sound that comes from the mass of water moving through the channel at velocity, the energy of an entire watershed concentrated in a single corridor. He had written, April 14th, 12:30 a.m., gauge, 5.7 feet, rising rapidly, flow, turbid, high velocity, debris, terrace inundated, flood stage reached, rainfall, continuing, peak not yet arrived. He had driven back to the house and had sat at his desk with the radar on his laptop and the engineering log open in front of him. The peak flow in his analysis had been calculated to arrive at his gauge location approximately 90 minutes after the watershed's rainfall intensity peaked. The travel time for the runoff from the upper basin to reach his property, routing through the creek's channel and the tributary network. The radar showed the peak intensity had been around 11 p.m. 90 minutes from 11 p.m. was 12:30 a.m. The gauge had been at 5.7 feet at 12:30 and was still rising. He had driven to the gauge at 1:15 a.m. The gauge read 7.4 feet. He had driven to the gauge at 1:50 a.m. The gauge had read 8.9 feet at 1:50 a.m., a reading that Raymond had looked at for several seconds before writing it down. His flashlight on the staff, the water surface surging past the graduated markings, with the specific unsteadiness of a creek at or near peak flow. The surface boiling slightly where the high-velocity flow encountered the gauge's concrete footing. The creek was running bank full plus 3 feet on his gauge, the inundation extending far across both terraces, the sound of the water a continuous roar that was audible over the rain. He had written, April 14th, 1:50 a.m., gauge, 8.9 feet, approaching peak, flow, extremely high velocity, heavy debris, roaring. Both terraces inundated. Rainfall appears to be diminishing. Peak intensity passed. He had driven to the former dam site. He had stood at the edge of the channel where the embankment had stood. The restored cross-section now carrying a volume of water that the channel had not seen at this velocity since before Harold Ogle had built the dam in 1961. The creek was running through the former dam footprint without constraint, without the pond to absorb it, without the 8.4 acre-feet of storage to slow it, the full peak discharge of a 4,200-acre watershed, concentrated and moving south at the velocity his model had predicted. He had looked at the water and had felt no satisfaction. He was an engineer looking at a hydraulic condition he had calculated months earlier, confirming that the model was correct, and understanding exactly what the model's correctness meant for the floodplain 2 miles downstream. He had driven to the gauge at 2:17 a.m. The gauge read 9.1 feet. He had written, April 14th, 2:17 a.m. Gauge, 9.1 feet. Peak flow. Gauge reading at maximum, beginning to recede. Flow velocity, extreme. Estimated peak discharge at gauge location, 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second based on rating curve. He had paused and had written the next line slowly. Analysis predicted 1,247 cubic feet per second at this location for 10-year storm event without impoundment. Observed, 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second. Model confirmed. He had closed the log and had sat in his truck at the gauge for a moment with the engine running and the rain on the windshield easing to a moderate fall, the worst of the storm passing through, the creek still roaring in the darkness beyond his headlights. He had done the travel time calculation in his head. He had run it in the model a dozen times, and he knew the numbers without reference. Peak flow at his gauge location at 2:17 a.m. The channel reached from his southern property boundary to the Millbrook Crossing floodplain, approximately 2 miles, the routing velocity in the channel at flood stage. He had calculated 4.2 feet per second in the HEC RAS model, which translated to approximately 2.9 miles per hour. 2 miles at 2.9 miles per hour, 41 minutes. He had written in the log below the gauge reading, estimated arrival at Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary, 2:17 a.m. plus 41 minutes, equals approximately 2:58 a.m. No attenuation, full peak discharge. He had driven back along the county road to the southern boundary of his property and had stopped where the road curved east and the creek's floodplain opened to the south. The 2 miles of agricultural land between his property and the subdivision, the fields flat and dark in the rain, the creek invisible in the darkness but audible, the roar carrying across the flat ground in a way that creek sound does not carry in normal conditions. He had rolled down his window and listened. He had driven back to the house at 2:40 a.m. and had sat at his desk with the log open. He had written the complete entry. April 14th, 2023, 2:17 a.m. Peak flow at former dam site gauge, 9.1 feet / estimated 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second. Analysis predicted 1,247 cubic feet per second for 10-year storm without impoundment. Model confirmed within margin of error. Estimated downstream arrival at Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary, 2:58 a.m. No attenuation. Full peak discharge. Subdivision stormwater infrastructure design capacity, 770 cubic feet per second. Estimated arriving flow, 1,581 cubic feet per second per analysis routing model. He had written below that, "I have done what I could do. I built the analysis. I sent the warning. I filed the objection. I appealed the determination. I sent the notification. I recommended the board review the analysis twice in certified mail correspondence. The dam is gone because a county process was used as collections leverage, without engineering review, and a county staff employee upheld a removal order without reading a 42-page technical document. The record of all of that is complete and dated and in Linda Voss's file. He had stopped writing and had looked at the clock. 2:58 a.m. He had not slept. He had driven out at 5:45 a.m. First light, the rain stopped, the sky a flat gray with the clearing that follows the back edge of a storm system. He had driven south on the county road, past his property's southern boundary, through the 2 miles of agricultural land, the fields on both sides showing the shallow standing water of a watershed that had received more rain than its soil could absorb. The creek was visible from the road in 2 places, running high and turbid, and beginning to recede from peak, the channel banks still overtopped in the flat sections. He had turned west on the county road that skirted the northern boundary of the Millbrook Crossing subdivision, the road that ran along the subdivision's edge before crossing the creek at the community entrance bridge. He had stopped the truck a quarter mile before the bridge. The road was flooded, not the creek's crossing, the road itself, the county road running along the subdivision's northern boundary. Water standing across both lanes in a broad sheet that extended as far east as he could see from the stopped truck. The water was 8 to 10 inches deep at the road's edge, the surface calm now, the flood pulse having peaked and the water beginning to spread and slow across the flat ground. He could see the white posts of the subdivision's entrance sign above the water line, the sign itself partially submerged, the top third of the lettering readable above the surface. He had looked over the water across the subdivision's northern boundary. He could see roof lines, the eastern sector's houses, the lots he had identified in the analysis, the 11 to 18 homes at ground elevations between 845.8 and 847.1 feet. The homes he had estimated would experience first-floor inundation under the removal scenario's modeled flood stage of 849.2 feet. The roof lines were visible above the water that covered the subdivision's interior roads and yards, the peaked roof lines of single-family homes standing above a flat brown surface that reflected the gray morning sky. He had counted the roof lines he could see from the road, 8, 9, 10 visible from his position, more obscured by the subdivision's tree line and the curve of the terrain. He could not see how deep the water was at the houses from this distance. He could see that it was there. He had sat in the truck for a long time with the engine running and the heater on, and the gray morning light spreading across the flooded landscape. He had been an engineer for 38 years. He had calculated flood impacts, designed flood mitigation systems, reviewed downstream consequence analyses for dam removal projects in 4 states. He had never sat in a truck, watching the consequence of a calculation he had made and warned against, and been ignored about. He had taken out his camera and had photographed the scene from the truck, the flooded road, the subdivision entrance sign, the roof lines above the water surface, the flat brown expanse of the inundated eastern sector. He had noted the time in his log, 5:52 a.m. He had driven back to the house. He had called Linda Voss at 6:15 a.m. She had answered on the 3rd ring, her voice indicating she had been awake. He had said, "Linda, Raymond, the subdivision flooded." She had said, "How bad?" He had said, "I can see roof lines from the county road. The road into the subdivision is underwater. I don't know the interior condition yet. I photographed what I could see from the road at 5:52 this morning." She had said, "Don't go into the subdivision. Don't speak to residents. Document everything from public roads and your own property only." He had said, "I know." She had said, "Send me the photographs as soon as you can. "I'm going to file a formal legal notice with the county today," he had said. "The gauge reading at peak was 9.1 feet. My model predicted 1,247 cubic feet per second at that location. The observed peak was 1,180 to 1,240, based on the rating curve. The model was right, Linda. It was within the margin of error." She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "I know." He had said, "They had the analysis. They had it in August. They had the warning letter in August and again in October." Dennis Carr wrote, "Reviewed in a determination" without reading it. The commissioner called the chair and got the appeal hearing canceled. The TRO judge looked at the administrative process and not at the engineering. Linda had said, "Raymond, the record is complete. Every document, every date, every certified mail receipt. The analysis said 1,247 cubic feet per second, and the gauge read 9.1 feet, and 41 homes are going to be assessed for flood damage this morning by insurance adjusters who are going to want to know why a creek that had a functioning permitted dam for 62 years flooded a subdivision the 1st April after the dam was removed." He had said, "The file answers that question." She had said, "I know it does." He had set the phone down and had opened his engineering log and had written the morning's final entry below the night's gauge readings and calculations. April 14th, 2023, 5:52 a.m. Drove to Millbrook Crossing northern boundary. County road flooded, standing water across both lanes. Subdivision eastern sector inundated. Roof lines visible above water surface. Photographed from public road. Gauge peak, 9.1 feet / 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second. Model prediction, 1,247 cubic feet per second. Variance, within margin of error. He had looked at the page, the night's entries running from April 12th through the dawn hours of April 14th, the gauge readings in sequence, the estimated arrival time, the model confirmation, the roof lines above the water. He had written one final line at the bottom of the page, below everything else, in the same handwriting he had used in this log for 35 years. The watershed tested it. The county's emergency management office had issued a disaster declaration for the Millbrook Crossing area at 7:40 a.m. on April 14th, the declaration triggering the county's emergency response protocol, the fire department's water rescue unit deployed to the subdivision's eastern sector by 8:15, the flat-bottomed rescue boats moving through the flooded interior roads between the houses whose ground floors were underwater. The water had peaked at the subdivision between 3 and 4 a.m., the flood pulse Raymond had estimated arriving at 2:58, having crested through the eastern sector at a flood stage that the county's post-event survey would later establish at 849.4 feet above mean sea level, 0.2 of a foot above Raymond's modeled prediction of 849.2. The survey measurement had been made from a benchmark on the subdivision's community center building, the high water mark visible on the building's exterior wall as a mud line at 4 feet 11 inches above the finished floor elevation. The rescue operation had evacuated 31 residents from the eastern sector's flooded homes between 8 a.m. and noon. Elderly residents who had not evacuated during the night, a family with an infant, 3 residents who had been unable to reach their vehicles before the water had surrounded them. The fire department's incident report had noted that access to the eastern sector had been severely limited by the flooded community road, and that the rescue boats had been the only practical means of reaching the inundated homes. By noon, the water had receded enough in the western sector and the community road to allow emergency vehicles on wheels. The county's emergency management coordinator, a woman named Sharon Dell, had walked the eastern sector that afternoon with 2 assistants, clipboard in hand, moving house to house through the ankle-deep receding water that remained on the streets, noting the high water marks on every structure, photographing the damage visible through ground floor windows, knocking on doors where residents had returned. Sharon had been doing emergency damage assessment for 12 years. She had assessed hurricane damage on the coast, creek flooding in the Piedmont, dam failure inundation in the western part of the state. She had walked flooded neighborhoods enough times to read the water's record on a house from the outside, the mud line on the foundation, the debris caught in the window frames, the staining on the exterior siding that showed exactly how high the water had stood against the wall. What she had seen in Millbrook Crossing's eastern sector had been among the more severe residential flood events she had assessed at a subdivision scale, not because the water had been deepest, but because of the combination of depth and velocity, the evidence of fast-moving water visible in the debris patterns, and the structural damage to the homes closest to the creek channel. 3 of the eastern sector homes had foundation damage, the creek's flow having undercut the fill on which the houses sat, the exposed foundation corners visible after the water receded as eroded soil, the concrete block showing where the surrounding grade had been stripped away. The final damage assessment had taken 11 days, Sharon's office working through the eastern sector systematically. Each of the 41 flooded homes assessed for structural damage, mechanical system damage, and contents loss. The assessments compiled into a single damage report submitted to the county administrator on April 25th. 41 homes with documented flood damage, 7 condemned. The 3 with foundation damage plus 4 whose mechanical systems, including HVAC and electrical panels, had been submerged long enough to render them hazardous without complete replacement. The condemnation notices posted on the front doors by the county building official on April 22nd. The community road, the subdivision's primary access road, which crossed the creek on a concrete bridge, had experienced scour damage at the bridge's eastern abutment, the flowing water having undercut the abutment's footing on the downstream side. The bridge deck cracked along its eastern span. The road closed to vehicles by county order on April 15th. The insurance industry's response had been immediate, adjusters from 6 different carriers arriving in the subdivision within 48 hours of the flood, the claims process beginning while the mud was still wet on the ground floors of the eastern sector homes. The aggregate insurance estimate, compiled from the individual carrier assessments and reported to the county in early May, had placed the total insured damage at $4.2 million. The 41 residential claims, the community road damage, and the HOA's common area infrastructure. The estimate covered insured losses only. The uninsured losses, the contents claims that exceeded policy limits, the displacement costs for the 7 condemned households, the loss of use claims from residents who had vacated during repairs, were additional. The county administrator had ordered the engineering review on April 17th, 3 days after the flood, the order driven by a combination of political pressure from the Millbrook Crossing residents' advocacy group that had formed within 48 hours of the flood, and a memo from the county attorney's office noting that the county had issued a dam removal order without conducting an independent engineering review of the objecting landowner's technical submission, and that the county's liability exposure in the flood's aftermath depended significantly on what an independent engineering review of that submission would conclude. The county had retained Dr. Patricia Hume, a licensed civil engineer with a doctorate in watershed hydrology from Virginia Tech, 28 years of practice in dam safety, flood hydrology, and downstream impact assessment, a former state dam safety program engineer who had spent 12 years reviewing dam removal permit applications for the State Water Control Board before entering private practice. She was the kind of expert whose qualifications were so comprehensive that no attorney on either side of any subsequent litigation would challenge her to her face. Dr. Hume had received the complete county file on April 20th, Raymond's 42-page objection, the original abatement complaint, Dennis Carr's 1-page determination, the appeal record, including the commissioner's call to the commission chair, the TRO filing and the court's denial order, and the VDEQ removal permit. She had also requested and received Raymond's engineering log, the complete 11-notebook series, which Linda had produced on Raymond's authorization, and the NWS meteorological record for the April 13th to 14th storm event. She had worked for 3 weeks. Her report had been delivered to the county administrator on May 15th, 67 pages, the most thorough independent technical review of a small dam removal decision that the county's engineering staff had encountered in institutional memory. The report's findings section had been 9 pages. Dr. Hume had written with the directness of an expert who had spent 28 years producing technical findings for regulatory bodies and understood that clarity served the record better than qualification. Finding 1. Raymond Ogle's hydrological analysis, submitted to the county in August 2022, was technically sound. The watershed delineation was accurate. The TR55 methodology had been correctly applied to the watershed's characteristics. The HEC-RAS routing model had been properly constructed with appropriate cross-section data and roughness coefficients. The downstream impact calculations, including the 340% increase in peak flow velocity at the Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary under removal conditions, were within the expected range of accuracy for the methods used. The April 14, 2023 flood events observed peak flow at Raymond's gauge location had been 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second, compared to Raymond's modeled prediction of 1,247 cubic feet per second for a 10-year storm event without the impoundment. The observed event's meteorological record confirmed it was consistent with a 10-year return period storm. The analysis was correct. Finding 2. The county should have commissioned an independent engineering review before upholding the removal notice. Dennis Carr's determination had stated that the technical objection had been reviewed. It had not been reviewed by an engineer. The referral to the county engineer's office had been made but not completed. An independent engineering review of Raymond's analysis, conducted before the determination was upheld, would have confirmed the analysis's technical soundness and would have provided the county with the information necessary to make an informed regulatory decision. The failure to conduct that review was an administrative error with material consequences. Finding 3. The dam's removal was the proximate contributing factor in the flood's severity at the Millbrook Crossing floodplain during the April 14, 2023 storm event. Under existing conditions, with the impoundment in place, the same storm event would have produced an estimated peak discharge of 390 to 430 cubic feet per second at the Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary, within the subdivision's stormwater infrastructure design capacity of 770 cubic feet per second, below the base flood elevation, and unlikely to produce first-floor inundation in the eastern sector. Under the removal conditions that existed on April 14, 2023, the same storm produced an estimated 1,520 to 1,640 cubic feet per second at the floodplain boundary, more than twice the infrastructure's design capacity and consistent with the observed flood stage of 849.4 feet. The impoundment's removal transformed a manageable storm event into a damaging flood event for the downstream subdivision. Finding 4. The 1961 permit number 1961-CR-004, was valid and in continuous effect at the time the removal notice was issued. The removal notice's characterization of the structure as unpermitted was factually incorrect. A review of the county's own permit records would have identified this error before the notice was issued. The report's recommendation section had been 2 pages. Dr. Hume had recommended that the county establish an engineering review protocol requiring independent technical assessment of any dam removal notice that was contested on hydrological grounds, that the county's agricultural nuisance abatement process be amended to require a determination by a licensed engineer before a removal notice affecting a permitted structure could be issued, and that the county commission review the circumstances of the October 2022 appeal dismissal in the context of the administrative error documented in Finding 2. The report's final paragraph had been a single sentence that Dr. Hume had written and rewritten 3 times before settling on the version that was in the delivered document. The information necessary to prevent this flood event was available to the county in August 2022, was submitted by a licensed engineer with 38 years of relevant professional experience, and was not read by anyone with the qualifications to evaluate it before the removal was ordered to proceed. Linda had filed the formal legal opinion on Raymond's behalf on May 18th, 3 days after Dr. Hume's report was delivered to the county, the timing deliberate, the opinion building directly on Dr. Hume's findings and extending their legal implications. The opinion was addressed to the county administrator, the county attorney, and the Millbrook Crossing HOA's board of directors. It was 14 pages. The first section established the factual record, the HOA's 2019 assessment error, the 4 years of documented disputes, the board's April 2022 vote to pursue abatement as a collections mechanism. the abatement complaints filing by Gary Sutter in May 2022. Linda had obtained the HOA's board meeting minutes for the April 2022 meeting through the HOA's records production process, and the minutes contained the specific language she had been looking for: Connie Marsh's presentation of the abatement strategy as a collections tool and the board's vote to authorize it. The minutes had been produced by the HOA's management company in response to a records request Linda had filed in November 2022, after the dam was removed and before the flood, in preparation for exactly this use. She had quoted the minutes directly in the opinion's first section. Board President Marsh presented the agricultural nuisance abatement process as a collections mechanism to compel payment of outstanding HOA assessments from parcel 44-0112-001. The board voted 4-1 to authorize filing of the abatement complaint. The second section addressed the abatement complaint's technical basis, the complaint's characterization of the dam as an unpermitted structure creating downstream nuisance conditions, the permit that had been on file in the county's own records since 1961, the absence of any engineering analysis in the complaint's supporting documentation. Linda had obtained the complaint file from the county's agricultural nuisance office and had confirmed that the complaint contained no technical analysis of the dam's downstream effects, no hydrological assessment, no engineering evaluation of any kind. Gary Sutter had filed a nuisance complaint against a permitted hydraulic structure without any engineering basis for the nuisance characterization. The third section was the warning letter record, the August 2022 cover letter with the 340% figure, the certified mail receipt signed by Connie Marsh, the October 2022 downstream notification letter with the recommendation that the board obtain an independent engineering review, the certified mail receipt signed by Connie Marsh, 2 warnings, 2 signed receipts, 2 documented deliveries of information that the board had received and not acted on. The fourth section was the damages analysis, the HOA's abatement complaint as the initiating cause in the causal chain that produced the removal as the proximate cause of the flood's severity, as established by Dr. Hume's independent analysis. The flood as the cause of $4.2 million in insured damages to 41 households who had no role in the board's decision to use the abatement process as collections leverage. Linda had written, "The HOA's board authorized the abatement complaint as a collections mechanism. The complaint was filed without engineering basis against a permitted structure. The county issued a removal order without independent engineering review. The landowner objected with a technically sound 42-page hydrological analysis that was not reviewed by a qualified engineer. The landowner warned the HOA twice in writing of the downstream impact. The warning was received and not acted upon. The dam was removed. The creek flooded. The record of each of these events is documented, dated, and in this file. The opinion's conclusion was 3 sentences. The HOA's abatement complaint was filed without engineering basis as a collections mechanism for an assessment that had no legal foundation. The HOA received written warning of the downstream impact of the removal it had initiated twice, in August and October 2022, and did not commission an independent engineering review. The individual board members who voted to authorize the abatement complaint and who received and disregarded the warning correspondence are exposed to personal liability for the consequential damages flowing from those decisions. Connie Marsh had received Dr. Hume's report and Linda's legal opinion on the same day. The county administrator's office had sent Dr. Hume's report to the HOA's board as a matter of public record, and Linda had sent her opinion directly to the board by certified mail. Connie had read Dr. Hume's finding 3. The dam's removal was the proximate contributing factor in the flood's severity, and had set the report on her desk and had looked at it for a long time. She had read Linda's legal opinion next. She had read the board meeting minutes quotation, her own words from the April 2022 meeting, the phrase collections tool, the 4-1 vote. She had read the warning letter section, the August letter, the certified mail receipt, the October letter, the certified mail receipt. 2 receipts with her signature on the green cards. She had called Gary Sutter at 4:17 p.m. Gary had answered. She had said, "Gary, I need you to read 2 documents, Dr. Patricia Hume's engineering report and a legal opinion from Linda Voss." I'm sending them to you now. He had said, I've already seen them. The county sent Dr. Hume's report to Council of Record this morning. She had said, what is our exposure? He had been quiet for a moment, the specific silence of an attorney whose client is asking a question whose honest answer is going to be difficult to deliver. He had practiced collections law for 18 years. He had filed the abatement complaint as a collections mechanism on the board's instruction, without commissioning an engineering review of the complaint's technical claims, because the complaint's technical claims had been Connie's characterization of the dam, and he had filed what the client had told him to file. He had said, the legal opinion's damages theory is viable. The board meeting minutes showing the abatement was authorized as a collections tool are a significant document. The 2 warning letters with the signed receipts are a significant document. Dr. Hume's finding that the removal was the proximate contributing factor in the flood severity provides the causation link. Connie had said, personal liability. He had said, potentially. Directors and officers insurance covers board members acting in good faith within their authority. A board that authorizes an abatement complaint as a collections tool against a parcel outside the HOA's boundary receives 2 written warnings of downstream flood impact from a licensed engineer and does not commission an independent review. That is a record that a plaintiff's attorney is going to use to argue the board was not acting in good faith. Connie had said, we didn't know the dam was a flood buffer. Gary had said, you were told, twice, in writing, with certified mail receipts bearing your signature. The line had been quiet for several seconds. Connie had said, what do we do? Gary had said, I recommend you retain a specialist in environmental and water law immediately. This is beyond my practice area. It has been beyond my practice area since I filed the abatement complaint, and I should have told you that in May of last year. He had said it with the flatness of a man stating a fact he had been aware of for some time, and had not stated until the fact had produced $4.2 million in flood damage, and a 67-page engineering report, and a 14-page legal opinion, and 41 damaged homes in a floodplain subdivision that had been built 2 miles downstream of a dam that a board president had decided was a collections lever. Connie had set the phone down and had looked at Dr. Hume's report on her desk. The cover page, Dr. Patricia Hume, Ph.D., P.E., the county seal, May 15, 2023. The tab on the report's spine read Cutler Creek Dam Removal, Independent Engineering Review. She had thought about the August letter, the 1-sentence warning, the 340% figure. She had thought about the October notification letter. I recommend the board obtain an independent engineering review. She had thought about the filing cabinet where she had put Raymond's completion letter in November under abatement, resolved, and had written to the collections coordinator. Ogle matter resolved. The matter had not been resolved. It had been waiting for April. The county commission hearing had been set for June 8th, 7 weeks after the flood, the commission convening a formal administrative review session open to the public and recorded in the official minutes. The hearing room had been full. Residents from Millbrook Crossing occupied most of the gallery seats. The 7 families whose homes had been condemned sat in the front rows, with the specific presence of people who have lost something and have come to a public room to understand why. Raymond sat in the gallery with Linda beside him. He had brought his engineering log. The commission had convened at 9 a.m., 5 commissioners, the county administrator at the staff table, Dr. Patricia Hume present as the county's retained expert, Dennis Carr present as the staff reviewer, and the county attorney at the legal counsel table. Gary Sutter had submitted a written statement and had not appeared in person. Connie Marsh had appeared with Rachel Odom, the environmental attorney the board had retained 3 weeks after Gary told her this was beyond his practice area. Rachel's expression the controlled neutral of an attorney managing a difficult factual record in a public forum. Dr. Hume had presented first, 40 minutes, her 4 findings delivered in plain language for an audience of commissioners and residents who had not spent their careers in watershed hydrology. She had shown 2 figures, the before and after peak flow comparison at the Millbrook Crossing boundary, 412 cubic feet per second with the dam, 1,581 cubic feet per second without, and the administrative timeline from the complaint filing in May 2022 through the determination in September and the removal in October. She had presented finding 2 and had said, The information necessary to make an informed regulatory decision was submitted by the landowner in August 2022. It was 42 pages. It was not reviewed by a qualified engineer before the determination was issued, or before the appeal was dismissed. A commissioner had asked, if the analysis had been reviewed by a qualified engineer before the determination, what would the review have concluded? Dr. Hume had said, it would have concluded what my review concluded. The analysis was technically sound. A qualified engineer reviewing it in August 2022 would have recommended against issuing the removal order. The commissioner had said, and the flood would not have happened. Dr. Hume had said, the dam's removal was the proximate contributing factor in the flood's severity. With the dam in place, the April 14th storm would not have produced first-floor inundation in the eastern sector. The room had been quiet. Dennis Carr had been called next. He had said, I forwarded the technical submission to the county engineer's office for review. The review was not completed. My supervisor indicated the determination should proceed. I wrote the determination based on the complaint and the cover letter. The commission chair had said, you wrote that the technical objection had been reviewed. Dennis had said, I had forwarded it for review. The chair had said, forwarding for review and conducting a review are different things. Dennis had said, yes. Rachel Odom had been given 15 minutes. She had focused on the county's independent obligation to evaluate the complaint adequately and had said, the HOA filed a complaint. The county's process required the county to evaluate it. The county's failure to conduct an engineering review was the county's administrative error. Linda had taken 10 minutes. She had set one document on the table, the August 2022 warning sentence, enlarged to 18-point type, the certified mail delivery date written below it in red ink, and had said, the HOA filed a complaint without reviewing the county's own permit records. The HOA received 2 written warnings from a licensed engineer, predicting a 340% increase in flood velocity at their own subdivision boundary. They signed the certified mail receipts and did not commission an engineering review. The county's process was inadequate. The HOA's initiation of that process was also without basis. Both facts are in the record. She had left the document on the table and returned to her seat. The commission's findings had been issued the same afternoon. Finding 1. The removal notice was factually incorrect in characterizing the structure as unpermitted. Permit number 1961-CR-004 had been in the county's own records since 1961. Finding 2. The failure to complete the engineering review referral before issuing the determination was an administrative error. The determination stated the technical objection had been reviewed. It had not been reviewed by a qualified engineer. Finding 3. The October 2022 appeal dismissal, accomplished through a commissioner's direct communication with the commission chair, outside the normal scheduling process, was procedurally irregular and had denied the petitioner a hearing to which he was entitled. The commission referred the matter to the county's Ethics Review Board. Finding 4. Dr. Hume's report was accepted into the administrative record as an accurate technical assessment of both the removal's downstream consequences and the adequacy of the original review process. The HOA's Directors and Officers Insurance Carrier had reviewed the claims file for 2 weeks before calling Rachel Odom. The examiner had said, I need to ask about 2 documents, the August 2022 cover letter and the October 2022 notification letter. Rachel had said, both received by the board president, certified mail, signed receipts. The examiner had said, the August letter contains a 1-sentence warning that removal would increase peak storm flow velocity at the subdivision boundary by 340% during a 10-year storm event. The board received this warning and did not commission an engineering review. Rachel had said, the board relied on the county's regulatory process. The examiner had said, the board initiated the county's regulatory process as a collections mechanism. The board meeting minutes used the phrase, collections tool. The board then received a warning that the process it had initiated for collections purposes would flood its own neighborhood, and took no action to investigate it. The Directors and Officers policy covers board members acting in good faith. The carrier's position is that the good faith standard is difficult to meet on that record. Rachel had said, the board relied on the county's regulatory process. The examiner had said, I heard you the first time. The carrier is going to contest coverage for the board members who voted to authorize the complaint and who received the warning correspondence. I wanted you to know that before the first case management conference. Rachel had set the phone down and looked at her notes. The coverage denial, the good faith standard, the August letter's one sentence, removal of this structure will increase peak storm flow velocity at the Millbrook Crossing floodplain boundary by an estimated 340% during a 10-year storm event. Raymond had written that sentence in August 2022. He had sent it certified mail. Connie had signed the green card. The sentence had been in the file since August 2022, and it was in the file in June 2023, and it would be in the file for as long as the litigation ran. One sentence, one date, one signature. The file showed what the file showed. Raymond had walked to the former dam site on the morning of June 9th, the day after the commission hearing, a clear morning in early summer, the creek running at its normal late spring flow rate through the gap where the earthen embankment had stood for 62 years. He had parked at the field's edge and had walked the path to the creek on foot, the same path he had walked every spring since 1987, when he inherited the property and took over the maintenance log, the path worn into the grass by his boots and Harold's before them, the route from the equipment barn to the dam site that 2 generations of Ogles had walked to check the spillway, read the pond level, and note the embankment's condition in the field notebooks that now sat in 11 volumes on the shelf in the house. The former dam site looked the way it had looked since October, the restored channel cross-section running through the footprint where the embankment had been, the erosion control seating fully established now after 8 months, the grass cover on the restored banks as solid and unremarkable as the surrounding pasture. If you had not known what had been there, you would not have known anything had been there. The creek ran through the gap as though the gap had always existed, the water indifferent to the engineering history of the ground it moved through. Raymond had stood at the bank and looked at the creek for a long time. The water was clear at June low flow, the turbidity of the April flood gone, the channel's gravel bars visible through the surface, the small hydraulic features that form in a natural channel at low flow, the riffles and pools that the impoundment had buried under 62 years of sediment, and that were reasserting themselves now that the sediment load had worked downstream, and the natural channel form was reestablishing. The creek was doing what creeks do when the engineering is removed, returning to its natural geometry, its natural flow regime, its natural relationship with the watershed above and the floodplain below. The natural relationship. Raymond had spent 38 years as a hydraulic engineer modifying natural relationships, dams and channels and stormwater systems, the infrastructure by which a developed watershed manages the water that falls on it. He understood the natural relationship between a watershed and its creek, the way a surgeon understands the natural relationship between a body's systems, precisely, professionally, and with a clear awareness of what happens when the modifications that mediate that relationship are removed without adequate preparation. The creek ran south from where he stood through 2 miles of agricultural land toward the floodplain where Millbrook Crossing's eastern sector homes were in various stages of repair or demolition, the 7 condemned houses being cleared now, the lots stripped back to grade, the families gone. He could not see the subdivision from the former dam site. He had never been able to see it from here. He had only been able to calculate it. He had calculated it correctly. He had taken the engineering log from his jacket pocket and had opened it to the first blank page after the April entries, the night's gauge readings, the peak flow estimate, the model confirmation, the roof lines at dawn. The June 8th hearing entry was the last written page. Dr. Hume's findings, the Commission's 4 findings, the ethics referral, the record accepted. He had uncapped his pen and had written the final entry standing at the creek's bank in the June morning, with the water running past his boots. June 9th, 2023, former dam site, Cutler Creek, parcel 44-0112-001. Dam constructed, 1961. H. Ogle, with County Soil Conservation Service. Permit number 1961-CR-004. Maintained 1961 to 2022. Ogle family. 62 years. 11 field notebooks. Removed October 28, 2022. By County Agricultural Nuisance Abatement Order. Complaint filed by Millbrook Crossing HOA as collections mechanism for assessment with no legal basis. Warning issued August 2022 and October 2022. Certified mail. Signed receipts. 340% increase in peak flow velocity predicted. Analysis. 42 pages. Reviews by county. 0. Flood. April 14, 2023. Peak flow at gauge. 9.1 feet. Estimated 1,180 to 1,240 cubic feet per second. Model predicted 1,247 cubic feet per second. Variance. Within margin of error. 41 homes flooded. 7 condemned. $4.2 million insured damages. Commission findings. June 8, 2023. Administrative error confirmed. Engineering review not conducted. Appeal irregularly dismissed. Dr. Hume's report accepted into record. He had paused and looked at the creek. The analysis was right. The warning was sent. The record is complete. He had written the final line slowly, the way he wrote the closing entry in every field notebook, not as a summary but as a statement of fact for whoever would read the log next. The same discipline Harold had used in the first notebook in 1961, when he had recorded the dam's completion and noted the spillway elevation and the pond's designed storage volume. The creek runs where it runs. The file is what the file is. He had capped the pen and closed the log. He had looked downstream one more time, south, along the creek's corridor through the flat agricultural land, the water moving at its June rate, the channel carrying nothing more than the watershed's normal base flow in the dry early summer. The same creek that had carried 1,200 cubic feet per second through this channel on an April night 7 weeks ago was running clear and quiet and entirely ordinary in the morning light, the way a creek looks in the calm between events. Raymond knew what the watershed above it looked like. He knew what the floodplain below it looked like. He knew what the gap behind him meant for the relationship between the two. The creek did not know any of that. The creek ran the way water runs, through the lowest available path, at the rate the watershed delivered it, into whatever geometry the channel offered. Harold had understood that when he built the dam in 1961. He had not built it because the creek needed containing. He had built it because the land needed water, and because a man who farmed in a watershed understood that you worked with the creek's energy rather than against it. The pond had been a working piece of agricultural infrastructure for 62 years, and it had been, incidentally, the buffer between a 4,200-acre watershed and a subdivision built in the floodplain 30 years after the dam was built, by developers who had not asked what was upstream. Raymond had walked back up the path to the truck, the path worn by 2 generations of boots, the equipment barn visible at the field's edge, the farmhouse beyond it, where Harold's engineering log had started, and Raymond's had continued, and where all 11 notebooks now sat on the shelf, waiting for whatever came next in the county's civil courts. He had driven back to the house and had set the log on the shelf beside the others, the newest notebook next to the 10 before it, the spines facing out, the dates on each spine running from 1961 to 2023 in Harold's handwriting, and then his own. He had looked at the row of notebooks for a moment. 62 years of maintenance, 1 removal order, 1 flood, 1 commission finding that the order should not have been issued the way it was issued. The creek ran where it ran. The file was what the file was.